The ship was the size of a house sitting flat on the sand, and it had been there long enough for the desert to start forgetting it was ever anything else. Juniper stopped at the base of the rusted hull, pressed her nose to the metal, and held completely still, the way she only did when she had already found what they were looking for. What was inside that ship had been waiting for someone to find it for a very long time. Cole had not planned to stop. He had been driving the back roads out past the old Arrow Basin since before the sun was fully up, the kind of driving he did when sleep quit on him and the walls of the house started pressing in. He had come over a ridge and seen them below, 40, maybe 50 ships, their hulls rising out of the pale sand like the ruins of a city that had sunk sideways. The sea that had carried them was gone. It had been gone for decades. The ships had stayed. He pulled over and sat with the engine running for a long time. He had heard about this place. Every man who had done time near here had heard about it. A graveyard of fishing trawlers and freight carriers from a sea that dried up when the rivers feeding it were redirected for cotton fields. The Soviets had done it. They had taken an inland sea and slowly over 40 years turned it into sand. The ships had no say in the matter, neither had the men who worked them. Juniper was already out of the truck before he opened his door. She moved through the sand with the particular low-body efficiency she used when the ground was uncertain. She passed 3 ships without stopping. She stopped at the 4th. He had watched her do this for 11 years. He had learned not to question the selection. He only questioned the timing. She pressed herself against the base of the hull. One paw lifted. Her amber eyes tracked something above her. An opening in the rusted steel, an old cargo hatch, 12 feet up, the cover hanging at a 45-degree angle, held by one corroded bolt. Cole looked up at it, then down at her, then up again. If you have ever stood in front of something that made no sense and felt your body decide before your mind did, you already know what happened next. He started climbing. If you are new here, subscribe. We go to places like this every week. And turn on the bell so you don't miss the next one. Before we go any further, have you ever found something in an abandoned place that felt like it had been left specifically for you to find? Drop it in the comments. Cole Merritt was a man in his early to mid-50s, built tall and lean with the quiet economic movements of someone who has spent a lifetime working. His brown hair, grown a little too long, was streaked with silver at the temples. His face was weathered and rugged, carved by the sun and by memories that were just as harsh. Yet his eyes held a deep, settled kindness that had survived everything. He pulled on his boots that morning the way he always did, left first, then right, the leather cracked and dark with use. He shrugged into his old brown leather jacket and left it unzipped, revealing the dark flannel shirt beneath. He had been in Kazakhstan for 14 months, not by accident and not by plan, somewhere between the two, the way most of the important things in his life had arrived. He had done a contract job for a water remediation company working on the former lake bed, environmental assessment, soil samples, the kind of work that required patience and the ability to sit with something broken without needing to immediately fix it. The contract had ended 6 weeks ago. He had not left. He had rented a room in a village 40 kilometers from the old shoreline. The woman who owned the house, Fatima, was 73 years old and had the habit of setting her tea glass down before answering any questions she considered serious. She had done it 7 times in their first conversation. He had counted. He had decided she was someone worth knowing. He had not told anyone back home how long he was staying. Not his sister in Knoxville. Not his former commanding officer, who checked in twice a year by email and expected a reply within the week. Not the woman he had almost married 8 years ago, who had told him at the end that the problem was not that he left. It was that he always seemed slightly relieved when he did. He had thought about that for 8 years. He had not yet decided if she was wrong. Juniper had been with him all 14 months. She had been with him for 11 years before that, found as a 2-year-old at a rescue in Asheville, gray and white coat, amber eyes, already calm in a way that suggested she had been calm since birth, as if she had simply decided early on that the world was worth observing at close range. She had crossed 8 time zones without complaint. She had adapted to the cold, the heat, the rain, and the particular smell of a dying sea with the same steady attentiveness she brought to everything. The thing Cole had not told anyone, not Fatima, not his sister, not anyone, was why he had really stayed. 6 weeks ago, on his last official day of work, he had found a document in the project archive, a land survey from 1973. His father's name was on it, not as a reference, not as a previous owner, as a signatory. His father had never been to Kazakhstan. As far as Cole knew, his father had never been east of Virginia. He had carried the copy of that document folded in his jacket pocket for 6 weeks. He had not unfolded it once. He already knew what it said. What he did not know was what it meant. Juniper had been watching him carry it. She did not say anything about it. She never did. But 3 days ago, she had started doing something new. Walking ahead of him on their morning drives instead of sitting in the back seat, pressing herself to the windshield with a focus that was different from her usual road watching, directional, like she was navigating. He had followed where she indicated. He had not asked why. That was how they had ended up here, at the edge of a graveyard of ships, in the middle of a desert that used to be a sea. The climb was harder than it looked. The hull was corroded but not crumbling. The steel had oxidized into something closer to stone than rust, rough under his hands, with edges that would open the skin if he moved carelessly. He found handholds in the old ladder brackets, most of them still solid. 14 feet. He had climbed worse. Juniper watched him from below without moving. Her nose worked in a slow, methodical sweep, not following a trail, building a picture. When he reached the hatch opening and pulled himself through, he heard her shift once in the sand below. One small sound. That was enough. The air inside hit him before the dark did. Sealed cold. Not the cold of the desert morning, which was drawing and sharp, but the cold of a contained space that had been sitting undisturbed for a very long time and had developed its own particular stillness. It smelled of metal and old oil, and something else underneath that he recognized and could not immediately name. He waited for his eyes to adjust. The cargo hold was large, maybe 40 feet long, 30 wide. He had expected debris, broken equipment, scattered crates, the accumulated disorder of abandonment. What he found instead was organized space, cleared space. The floor had been swept. Not recently, the grime had resettled over whatever cleaning had happened, but deliberately, at some point, by someone with a purpose. Along the port side, someone had built shelving from salvaged timber. The wood was mismatched, different grains, different thicknesses, cut from what was available rather than what was designed for the purpose. The shelves held tools, not rusted scattered tools, arranged tools, wrenches sorted by size, sockets in a fitted case, the foam insert shaped to each one, a surface grinder, its wheel intact. Drill bits in a labeled rack, the labels still legible. 4 millimeters, 6 millimeters, 8 millimeters, stepped up to 20 millimeters in a careful progression. On the workbench, a broad plank of laminated hardwood set on steel legs that had been welded directly to the ship's frame, a logbook lay open. The pen was still in the spine. Cole stopped. He stood still for a long time, looking at that pen. It was a simple blue ballpoint. The clip was broken. Someone had put it into the spine of the logbook carefully, the way you set something down when you intend to pick it up again. That person had not come back. The floor gave slightly under his boot near the workbench. Not broken, just soft, the planks having absorbed decades of moisture rising from the sand below. Rust had bled from the bolt heads in long vertical streaks down the port wall, orange-brown against the gray steel, each streak exactly the width of a finger. The fluorescent tube above the workbench had fractured along its length and hung at a 30-degree angle, held by one wire, the broken end black with years of oxidation. He looked at the logbook. He did not touch it yet. He looked at the rest of the hold. In the center of the floor, taking up most of the available space, was a hull, not a complete one, a partial hull, ribs of bent steel curved and bolted to a flat keel section, the framing of a boat maybe 30 feet long, roughly the size of a large fishing vessel. The welds were clean, not professional clean, but practiced clean. Someone who had learned the skill and then applied it carefully over time, making each joint better than the last. Someone had been building a boat, inside an old ship, in the middle of a desert, using steel salvaged from other ships in the graveyard. Cole stood in the middle of that half-built hull and looked at the ribs rising around him and could not make the thing make sense. Behind him, from somewhere in the hold, he heard a sound, a low sound, regular, not mechanical. Juniper was not in the hold. He had left her below, outside the hull. He had not heard her climb. He turned slowly. She was at the far end of the hold, in a section he had not yet reached, a section separated from the main space by a partial bulkhead, the doorway cut by hand, and the edges still showing the marks of an angle grinder. She was sitting in front of that doorway. She had not made any other sound. She was simply sitting there, in a space she could not have reached without him noticing, looking at him with an expression that was not waiting and was not urgency and was not anything he had a clean word for. He had no idea how she had gotten in. He had no idea how long she had been there. He crossed the hold quickly, stepping through the frame of the half-built hull, moving between ribs of steel. Juniper did not move when he reached her. She looked at the doorway, then at him, then at the doorway again. Her ears tracked left, not toward any sound he could hear, toward a sound he couldn't. Beyond the bulkhead was a second space, smaller than the hold. A former crew compartment, he thought, though all the bunk frames had been removed and the porthole covers were sealed with welded plate. Someone had converted it. The shelving here was different from the workbench area, lighter, built from thinner wood, the kind of shelving meant for storage rather than tools. It held boxes, labeled boxes, the labels in two languages, Russian and something else, written in a careful hand with a different pen than the logbook. He read the Russian labels: supplies, electrical, drawings, correspondence. He opened the one marked correspondence. Inside were letters, a thick bundle of them, 50, maybe 60 envelopes, bound with a piece of wire that had corroded around them, leaving a faint orange mark on the topmost envelope. The letters were addressed in Russian to a name he could not read. The handwriting was clear, but the name was stylized in a way that resisted his limited Russian. The return address on most of them was a city. He recognized it after a moment. Aralsk, the last city on the old shoreline before the water receded beyond reach. He set the correspondence box aside and opened drawings. Technical drawings, architectural almost, detailed plans for a vessel. Not the partial hull in the main hold, or not only that. These drawings showed a completed boat, 41 feet, a workboat design, double-hulled shallow draft, the kind of vessel that could operate in low water. The drawings were precise and numbered, sheet 1 of 34 through sheet 34 of 34, each one signed with an initial in the lower right corner. The initial was M. He turned back to the logbook. Juniper pressed herself against his leg. Her body was warm. He had not realized he was cold until that moment. He crossed to the workbench and looked at the logbook without touching it. The open page was covered in dense handwriting. Russian again, columns of measurements and dates. The last entry was dated. He could read dates. He had learned that much. The last entry was from 31 years ago. He touched the pen in the spine. He picked it up. He set it down again. He picked up the logbook from the bottom, careful not to disturb the open page, and carried it to the light from the hatch opening. He sat on the floor of the hold with his back against the hull frame and the logbook on his knees and Juniper sitting next to him, and he started to work through what he could read. Numbers he could follow. Dates. The repeated initials, M, sometimes MK, appearing at the end of each entry. Measurements that corresponded to the drawings in the box. Frame spacings, keel dimensions, steel grade notations. Whoever MK was had been doing this methodically, entry by entry, week by week, for what looked from the date range like 9 years. 9 years of work. In a dead ship. In a dried sea. Cole stared at the logbook and thought about 9 years of something and tried to understand what kind of man maintained that kind of patience. He turned to an earlier section. The first entry was dated 40 years ago. At the top of that first page, in larger letters than the rest of the entries, someone had written a single line. It was not a measurement or a notation. It was a sentence, and the sentence was in English. Cole's Russian was limited, his English was not. The sentence read, "If the sea will not come back to us, then we must be ready when it does." He sat with that for a long time, long enough for Juniper to get up, walk a slow circuit of the hold, and return to her position beside him. She put her head on his knee. He did not move. The sea had not come back. Diversion projects had taken it past the point of easy return. Efforts had been made. The northern section of the old lake had been partially restored by a dam project. He knew that from his remediation work. But the southern basin where these ships sat had stayed dry. The water was not coming. Whoever had written that sentence had known, somewhere underneath the hope, that the water was probably not coming, and had kept building anyway. Cole turned to the correspondence box and picked up the top letter. He opened it carefully, the envelope brittle at the fold. Inside was a single sheet, handwritten in Russian. He could not read most of it, but in the body of the letter, someone had written a name he could read, a name he knew. The name was William Merritt. He held the letter and did not move. Juniper lifted her head from his knee. She looked at his face. Then she looked at the letter. Then she made a quiet sound, not a bark, not a whine, something between the two. The sound she made when she had decided that whatever came next was his decision, not hers, and she wanted him to know she was paying attention. He put the letter down on the floor between them. He had 47 other letters in that bundle. His father's name might be in none of them. It might be in all of them. He had no way to know without reading them, and he could not read them. He looked at his hands. They had stopped moving. He stared at the letter on the floor. Tell me in the comments, have you ever found something with your family's name on it in a place that made no sense? A place they had no reason to be? He had no answer for himself either. He kept reading. He found 3 more letters with his father's name. In the third one, a different name appeared alongside it. M.K. Not as an initial this time, but spelled out, at least partially. Mikhail, the K, was followed by a surname he could not transliterate with confidence. He found the drawings box again and looked at sheet 1 of 34. In the title block, in the lower right corner, alongside the initial M, someone had also written, in smaller text in a different pen, one English word. The word was William. He sat back against the frame of the half-built hull. Above him, through the fractured fluorescent tube and the hatch opening, the desert light had shifted. It was later than he thought. He had been in here for more than 2 hours. He looked at the logbook. 40 years of entries. A boat that was never finished. Letters to a man who was dead. His father had died 16 years ago. Cole had been in theater when it happened. 18 days before he could get back. He had stood at the grave and done the math on 18 days for a long time afterward. He did not know what his father had been doing before he was born. He knew the outline. Army, Korea era, not deployed, stationed stateside, discharged in 1969. Went to work for a surveying company. Married. Cole was born 1971. That was the outline. Everything inside it, his father had kept there. He had found the land survey with his father's name 6 weeks ago. That survey was dated 1973, 2 years after Cole was born. His father had signed a document about land rights on the former Aral Sea lake bed in 1973. Now he was holding a drawing sheet with his father's name written on it in a boat workshop inside a dead ship in the middle of a desert. He folded the drawing sheet carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, next to the folded land survey he had been carrying for 6 weeks. The 2 pieces of paper were now together, for the first time, in the same pocket. He noticed that. He did not know what to do with it. Juniper stood suddenly. Her body language changed in the particular way it did when she had made a decision. Not tense, just committed. She walked to the far end of the crew compartment, past the boxes to the stern bulkhead. She sat in front of it and looked at the wall. Cole followed her. He put his hand on the bulkhead. It was steel plate bolted to the frame. But the bolts, he counted 6 of them, were not corroded into their threads the way the rest of the hull hardware was. They were clean, or cleaner. Someone had worked these bolts more recently than anything else on the ship. He went back to the tool shelves. He found the right socket size in 14 seconds. The labels made it easy. He found a ratchet handle. He went back to the bulkhead. The first bolt turned, then the second, then the third. The fourth required leverage. He braced against the frame and used his body weight and felt it give. The fifth, the sixth. The plate swung on a concealed hinge at the left edge. Not falling, hinged, built to swing. Behind it was a space the size of a large closet, and in that space was a chest, and on top of the chest was a photograph. Cole picked up the photograph. Two men standing in front of this exact ship, he could tell by the nameplate visible behind them, still readable in the old photograph. The ship's name in both Russian and English on the plate was Morning Return. Two men, one tall and lean, one shorter and broader, both young, late 20s, early 30s, squinting into the sun, both grinning. The tall one had his arm around the shorter one's shoulders. The shorter one was holding something, a rolled paper, architectural drawings, the corner of a blueprint visible at the edge. Cole knew the tall one immediately. He had seen that face in a dozen photographs. He had the posture memorized. He knew the jacket. His father had kept that jacket until it fell apart, had worn it until the elbows were gone. His father, 26, maybe 27 years old, standing in front of a ship in the Aral Sea, 30 years before the sea dried up, his arm around a man Cole had never seen in any photograph, in any box, in any house. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in his father's handwriting, in ink that had faded to pale brown, Bill and Misha, Aralsk, September 1969, the year his father left the army, Bill and Misha. Cole looked at the chest. It was a simple wooden chest, sealed with a hasp but not locked. He opened it. Inside was a letter. One letter set on top of everything else, addressed in English in a handwriting he did not recognize. To Bill's family, if anyone finds this. He sat on the floor of the hidden compartment with Juniper pressed against his right side and the letter in both hands, and read it twice before he understood all of it, and then read it a third time to be sure. The letter was from Mikhail Karimov. That was the full name. He had spelled it out at the top of the letter, careful and deliberate, as if he knew someone might need to find him and was making it possible. Mikhail Karimov, born in Aralsk, 1941. A shipwright's son. He had learned to build boats before he could read properly from his father, who had learned from his father. 3 generations of men who built vessels to travel a sea that was, when Mikhail wrote this letter, already dying. He had met Bill Merritt in September of 1969. Cole's father had been traveling, not with the army, not on any contract, just traveling, the way young men traveled in that era when they had a little money and nowhere particular they needed to be. He had arrived in Aralsk by train and walked down to the water and watched the boats come in, and Mikhail, who had some English from a school in Almaty, had spoken to him. They had talked on the dock for 4 hours. Then they had kept talking. Cole's father had stayed in Aralsk for 3 months. 3 months. Cole turned that over. His father had been discharged from the army in June of 1969. He was home for the holidays. Cole knew that because there were Christmas photographs from 1969, his father and his grandmother, the house in Richmond. But between June and December, 3 months, somewhere in the middle, his father had been here. Mikhail wrote that in those 3 months, Bill Merritt had helped him survey the southern basin. Not for a company, not officially, just 2 young men with a borrowed transit level and a notebook documenting the water depth along 40 kilometers of shoreline. It was Mikhail's project. He had been tracking the change in water levels for 2 years, watching the sea retreat, writing the numbers down, trying to make the retreat legible to someone who might be able to stop it, or at least bear witness to it. He had been writing letters to Soviet authorities. The letters were not answered. He had wanted a record in English, filed somewhere outside the Soviet system, somewhere that might survive what he was beginning to understand was coming. Bill Merritt had taken copies of the survey home. He had filed them where Mikhail did not know. He had promised to try. Cole thought about the land survey he had found in the project archive 6 weeks ago. His father's name as signatory, A water survey, 1973, 4 years after Aralsk. His father had tried. Whatever he had found to do with those numbers, he had done it. Mikhail wrote that he had not known when Bill left that the sea would be gone in his lifetime. He had suspected. He had not known. He had written to Bill for years. The stack of 57 letters in the correspondence box, Cole now understood, and Bill had written back 12 times, the 12 letters now in the chest below this one, until the letter stopped in 1987. He had not known why they stopped. He had kept writing anyway, because he had no better thing to do, and the writing kept the friendship alive in some form. The sea had been gone from the southern basin since the mid-1990s. Mikhail had watched the last of it go. He had stayed in Aralsk until the fishing industry collapsed, and then he had come here to this graveyard, to this specific ship, the Morning Return, which had been his father's boat. He had come to salvage what he could from a life that the diversion of two rivers had taken from him. He had started building. Cole read that section twice. He had started building. Not a house, a boat. A boat inside his father's boat, in the desert where the sea used to be. Why? Mikhail answered the question in the letter directly as if he had anticipated it. He wrote, "Because the restoration project in the north has started. Because water is coming back to the northern basin. Not to the south, not yet, not in my lifetime, I think. But the principle has been established. The water can be returned. It is a decision, not an inevitability. And if the decision is ever made, I want to be ready. I want a boat in the water before the week is out." He had been building a boat for the day the sea came back. Cole sat with that. Juniper stood, turned once, and lay back down with her chin on his leg. She did not look at him. She looked at the chest. He noticed the way she settled. Not restless, not anxious. The particular stillness of an animal that has decided the present moment is where it intends to be. He had spent 14 months in Kazakhstan telling himself he was staying for the work, then telling himself he was staying because leaving felt like the wrong direction without knowing the right one, then finding the survey and telling himself he was staying because he had a question to answer. He had carried that folded paper for 6 weeks and not opened it and not made any calls and not started anything. Mikhail Karimov had spent 9 years building a boat in the middle of a desert. Every week, coming to this ship, working the welds, logging the progress, writing letters to a dead man's family in case anyone ever came. Cole had spent 11 years with a tree who found things he did not know he was looking for. He did not name what he was feeling. He put the letter down on the floor next to the photograph and looked at the two of them for a long time, his father at 27, his father's name, written in a stranger's careful hand, in the letter left for someone who might never arrive. He thought, these men had kept faith with something in the absence of any proof it would matter. His father with the survey numbers. Mikhail with the welds and the logbook and the letters. Keeping faith not because they were certain of the outcome, but because keeping faith was the only response they had to a world that was taking something from them. Cole had known that kind of faithfulness once. He had not been particularly good at maintaining it. He reached into the chest and found his father's 12 letters. He did not read them. He folded them and put them in his jacket pocket with the photograph and the drawing sheet and the land survey. He would read them somewhere better than this, somewhere with light and time. At the bottom of the chest was one more object. Not a letter, a small notebook, separate from the logbook on the workbench, personal rather than technical, its cover soft with handling. He opened it to the last page. Mikhail had written a date, 11 years ago, and below the date, 2 lines. The first line was in Russian. The second was in English, carefully translated, the way a man translates when he wants to be precise. The boat is as far as I can take it. If the water comes, someone will know what to do with what I left here. Below that, an address in Aralsk, 11 years ago. Cole did a quick calculation. Mikhail Karimov would be 83 years old, if he was still alive. Juniper lifted her head. Her nose moved in the slow sweep, building a picture, not following a trail. She looked at Cole, then at the notebook, then at Cole again. He looked at the address for a long time. He had not won anything. He had not fixed anything. The sea in the south was still sand. The ships were still rusting. Whatever his father had done with the survey numbers in 1973, whatever door that had opened or failed to open, was 40 years settled and beyond reach. He could not give Mikhail back the sea. He could not give his father back to himself. But he had the address, and he had the photograph. And he had a man who had written 57 letters and left a boat half-built in an address in case someone came. He folded the notebook to the last page and put it in his pocket. He was different now. He did not know yet exactly how. He thought that was all right. He came back down through the hatch the way he had gone up, slower, more careful, his pockets heavier than they had been 2 hours ago. Juniper was below him before he was halfway down, sitting in the sand, watching him descend with the amber-eyed patience she had brought to 11 years of his complications. He dropped the last 4 feet. The sand took his landing. He stood up and looked at the morning return from the outside. Its rust-streaked hull, its nameplate still visible in the angled morning light, its hatch cover hanging at 45 degrees. Unchanged. It looked exactly the way it had when he arrived. He was not the same man who had climbed it. Juniper walked a half-step ahead of him, back through the graveyard of shums, between hulls that had once carried fish and freight across water that no longer existed. She did not look back at him. She knew where the truck was. She had always known where the truck was. He drove back toward the village with the window down and the desert cold moving through the cab. He drove in the particular silence that comes after something has been answered and something else has opened up in the space where the question used to be. He had never known until today that his father had kept faith with a vegan on the other side of the world for 18 years. He had never known that his father had carried something worth carrying and had carried it quietly, the way men of that generation carried things, without announcement, without the expectation of acknowledgement. He had never known that the land survey in a project archive was the last trace of something that had started on a dock in a dying sea. He thought, some things get buried so deep that finding them takes longer than the men who buried them had to give. He pulled into the village as the sun was getting properly warm. Fatima was in her courtyard. She looked at him when he came through the gate and set her tea glass down before he said anything. He told her he needed someone who could translate Russian letters. She looked at him for a moment. She said her nephew in Almaty had studied in Moscow and could read anything. She said this the way she said everything, as a fact, not as an offer, as if it had already happened. That night he sat at the table in his rented room with the photograph in front of him. His father and Misha, 1969. 2 young men, the rolled drawing in one hand, the sea behind them still full of water. He had spent a long time across his life being slightly relieved when he left things. He recognized that about himself. He had been sitting with it for a long time. He thought maybe staying is the harder thing. Maybe the men who stay, in the desert with the welds, with the unanswered letters, maybe they understood something he was still working toward. Juniper lay on the floor beside his chair. She shifted once, settling her weight. Outside, the desert was quiet the way only very large empty spaces are quiet, completely, and without apology. He had an address in Aralsk. He did not know if Mikhail Karimov was still alive. He had not asked Fatima because he wanted to have the question a little longer before he had the answer. He looked at the photograph one more time. He turned it face down, not because he was finished with it, because he would look at it again in the morning, and that was enough for now. "Let's go home," he said. Juniper did not move. She was already there. Some things don't need more than that. He never found out what his father said in those letters. That part was still Mikhail's.